London, July 1553. A 16-year-old is proclaimed Queen of England. 9 days later, she is overthrown. 7 months later, she is dead. Her name was Lady Jane Grey, a girl destroyed by a brutal fight for England's throne. We don't know exactly when Jane Grey was born. We don't know where. There's no birth certificate, no baptismal record, no official document that says, on this day, in this place, this child entered the world. For centuries, historians believed she was born in October 1537 at Bradgate House in Leicestershire, a sprawling estate with thick stone walls and manicured grounds. But more recent research suggests she might have been born in London in the spring of 1537, or maybe even 1536. Some contemporary sources claim she was 17 when she was executed in February 1554, which would push her birth back to early 1537 or late 1536. This uncertainty isn't unusual for the Tudor period. Record keeping was inconsistent, especially for noble children who weren't expected to shape history. But there's something haunting about it. This girl who would become queen for 9 days, who would die on a scaffold at 16 or 17, is a ghost even at her birth. What we do know is this: Jane Grey was born into one of the most dangerous families in England. Her father was Henry Grey, Marquess of Dorset, who would later become Duke of Suffolk. The Grey family had a long history of backing the right horses in English politics. They supported Henry Tudor when he fought Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, the battle that ended the Wars of the Roses and established the Tudor dynasty. That loyalty paid off. The Greys became fixtures at court, wealthy and powerful, their fortunes tied to the Tudor crown. Jane's mother was Frances Brandon, and this is where things get interesting and dangerous. Frances was the daughter of Mary Tudor, King Henry VIII's younger sister. That made Frances the king's niece, and it made Jane Grey the king's great-niece. Let's map this out because it matters. King Henry VII, Jane's great-great-grandfather, founded the Tudor dynasty. His son, Henry VIII, became king in 1509. Henry VIII's sister, Mary Tudor, married Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. Their daughter, Frances Brandon, married Henry Grey. Their daughter was Jane Grey. Jane carried Tudor blood. She was directly descended from the king who had united England after decades of civil war. And in the 1530s and 1540s, as Henry VIII struggled to produce a male heir, that bloodline became both a privilege and a curse. To understand Jane's story, you have to understand the chaos that defined English politics in the first half of the 16th century. And that chaos started with one man's obsession: King Henry VIII's desperate need for a son. When Henry became king in 1509, he was 18 years old, athletic, intelligent, charming, everything a Renaissance monarch should be. He married Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, and for a while everything seemed fine. But Catherine kept getting pregnant, and the pregnancies kept ending in tragedy: miscarriages, stillbirths, infant deaths. By the 1520s, only one child had survived, Princess Mary, born in 1516. A daughter. Now, England had never had a ruling queen. The closest it came was in the 12th century with Queen Matilda, and that ended in civil war. The nobles refused to accept her. The country tore itself apart. Henry looked at his daughter Mary and saw instability. He looked at his wife, Catherine, now in her 40s, and saw no hope of a male heir. He looked at the future and saw disaster. So he made a decision that would change everything. He would divorce Catherine and marry someone who could give him a son. That someone was Anne Boleyn. Here's the problem. Divorce wasn't really a thing in 16th century Catholic Europe. Marriage was a sacrament, binding until death. The only way out was an annulment, a declaration from the Pope that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. Henry argued that his marriage to Catherine was illegitimate because she'd been married to his brother Arthur before Arthur died. The Bible forbids a man from marrying his brother's widow, Henry claimed. Therefore, the marriage was cursed by God. That's why all the sons had died. Pope Clement VII wasn't convinced. He dragged his feet, he stalled, he refused. So Henry made a radical move. He broke from the Catholic Church entirely. In the early 1530s, influenced by Protestant reformers at court, Henry declared himself supreme head of the English Church. He dissolved his marriage to Catherine without Rome's approval. He married Anne Boleyn in secret, then made it public. And when Anne birthed a child in September 1533, Henry was certain it would be the son he'd been praying for. It was a girl, Elizabeth. Henry's break with Rome wasn't about theology, it was about power and succession. But once the door was open, Protestant reformers rushed through. Thomas Cranmer, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, began introducing changes: services in English instead of Latin, Bibles available to common people, and emphasis on faith over ritual. Then came the most dramatic change of all, the dissolution of the monasteries. Between 1536 and 1541, Henry's government shut down every monastery, priory, and religious house in England. Thousands of monks and nuns were displaced. Centuries-old institutions were erased. Vast estates were seized and sold off to the nobility and gentry. It was a religious revolution wrapped in a financial scheme. Henry made a fortune. So did families like the Greys. And Jane Grey was born right in the middle of it. Jane's early years are mostly a mystery. We know she grew up at Bradgate House, surrounded by wealth and privilege. We know she had two younger sisters, Catherine and Mary, born in 1540 and 1545. We know the household was Protestant. Her father embraced the new religion, not out of deep conviction, but because it was politically advantageous. The Greys were pragmatists. They followed power. But Jane? Jane was different. By the time she was 10 or 11, it was clear that she wasn't just going through the motions. She believed, deeply, passionately. She read the Bible in English, studied theology, corresponded with Protestant reformers across Europe. She wasn't just smart, she was brilliant. Roger Ascham, one of the leading scholars in England and tutor to Princess Elizabeth, visited Bradgate House in the summer of 1550. He later wrote about finding Jane in her chamber, reading Plato's Phaedo in the original Greek. Everyone else was outside enjoying the summer weather. Jane was alone with her books. Ascham asked her why. She said she found more pleasure in reading Plato than in anything else. Then she complained bitterly about her parents, how strict they were, how controlling, how they punished her for the smallest mistakes. It's one of the few glimpses we get of Jane's inner life. And what we see is a girl who is isolated, intellectually prodigious, and deeply unhappy. She didn't fit in, not with her family, not with her peers, not with the world she'd been born into. And that isolation would define the rest of her life. On January 28, 1547, King Henry VIII died. He was 55 years old, grotesquely obese, ravaged by infections and chronic pain from old jousting injuries. His final years had been marked by paranoia and brutality. He'd executed 2 of his 6 wives. He'd sent dozens of nobles, bishops, and commoners to the scaffold on charges of treason or heresy. But he'd also done something remarkable in his final weeks. He'd finalized his will and clarified the line of succession. His son, Edward, would inherit the throne. After Edward came Mary, his daughter by Catherine of Aragon. After Mary came Elizabeth, his daughter by Anne Boleyn. And after them, if all 3 died without heirs, came Jane Grey and her sisters. Jane was now 4th in line to the throne of England. Edward VI was 9 years old when he became king. Power immediately shifted to his uncle, Edward Seymour, who became Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector of the realm. Seymour was a committed Protestant. So was the young king, and so were the men they surrounded themselves with: Thomas Cranmer, Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, all reformers who wanted to push England further toward Protestantism. Under Henry VIII, the English Reformation had been cautious, inconsistent, driven by the king's personal needs rather than theological conviction. Under Edward VI, the gloves came off. In 1549, the Book of Common Prayer was published, a revolutionary document that standardized how church services would be conducted across England. Mass was now in English, not Latin. The liturgy was simplified. Anything that smacked of idolatry, statues, elaborate vestments, gold chalices, was stripped away. Churches were whitewashed. Altars were replaced with simple wooden tables. Priests became ministers. And it didn't stop there. Theologians at Cambridge and Oxford began redefining core doctrines. Transubstantiation, the Catholic belief that bread and wine literally become the body and blood of Christ during communion, was rejected. Only two sacraments were recognized: baptism and communion, the only ones explicitly mentioned in the Bible. This was Calvinism, the radical wing of Protestantism associated with John Calvin in Geneva. And Edward VI, a teenage king, embraced it wholeheartedly. For Jane Grey, this was everything she believed in. The faith she'd been raised in was now the official religion of England. She must have felt like history was moving in the right direction. She had no idea how quickly it would all fall apart. In 1548, Jane's life changed dramatically. She was sent to live at Sudeley Castle in the Cotswolds under the care of Thomas Seymour and Catherine Parr. Thomas Seymour was Edward VI's other uncle, younger brother of the Lord Protector, Somerset. He was ambitious, charming, reckless, and dangerous. Catherine Parr was King Henry VIII's sixth and final wife, the one who'd outlived him. She was intelligent, well-educated, and deeply Protestant. She'd written and published religious books, radical stuff for a woman in the 1540s. Seymour had married Catherine within months of Henry's death, a scandalous move that raised eyebrows across England. Royal widows were supposed to remain in mourning for at least a year. Marrying so quickly suggested either true love or calculated ambition. It was probably both. Seymour convinced Jane's parents to let him take custody of her by promising he'd arrange a marriage between Jane and Edward VI. If that happened, Jane would become Queen of England, not as a ruling monarch, but as the king's consort. For the Greys, it was an irresistible offer. Jane arrived at Sudeley Castle in early 1548. For a while, life there must have been good. Catherine Parr was a kind and attentive guardian. She oversaw Jane's education personally, encouraging her study of languages, theology, and classical texts. But then Catherine became pregnant, and in September 1548 she gave birth to a daughter, and died a week later, probably from postpartum infection. Jane was chief mourner at the funeral. She was 11 years old. Thomas Seymour, now a widower, grew increasingly erratic. He started scheming to displace his brother as Lord Protector. He tried to gain control of the young king. On the night of January 16, 1549, he was found near Edward's chambers at Hampton Court Palace, carrying a loaded pistol. The implication was clear. He'd been planning to kidnap the king. He was arrested, tried for treason, and executed in March 1549. Jane was sent home to Bradgate House. Back in Leicestershire, Jane's education continued under John Aylmer, a brilliant scholar who'd been supported by her father and had studied at Cambridge. Aylmer was everything a Renaissance humanist should be, fluent in Greek and Latin, steeped in classical philosophy, committed to Protestant theology. Under his guidance, Jane flourished. She read Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, all in the original languages. She studied the Church Fathers, the early Christian theologians who'd shaped doctrine in the centuries after Christ. She translated texts from Latin to Greek as exercises in linguistic precision, and she dove deeper into Protestant theology. By her early teens, Jane was corresponding with some of the most important Protestant reformers in Europe. She wrote to Heinrich Bullinger, the chief pastor of the Protestant congregation in Zurich. She thanked him for sending her a treatise on Christian perfection. She asked him questions about theology, about how to live a godly life. She was 14 years old. And she started learning Hebrew so she could read the Old Testament in its original language. This wasn't normal. Even among the highly educated nobility of Tudor England, this level of intellectual commitment was rare, especially for a girl. But Jane wasn't interested in being normal. She was interested in being right, theologically, morally, spiritually right. And that certainty, that conviction, would ultimately be her undoing. By 1552, Jane was spending more time at court. Her father had been made Duke of Suffolk after the previous duke and his brother both died of the sweating sickness. The Grey family was now among the most powerful noble families in England. Jane attended state banquets, she met foreign dignitaries, she was visible, important, part of the inner circle. And she had a complicated relationship with her royal cousins. With Elizabeth, things were cordial. Elizabeth was Protestant, like Jane. They shared intellectual interests. There wasn't much tension. But with Mary, that was different. Mary Tudor was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, raised as a devout Catholic. She'd watched her mother be humiliated and cast aside. She'd been declared illegitimate. She'd seen the Protestant Reformation tear apart everything she believed in. And she'd never stopped being Catholic. One day in the summer of 1552, Jane was visiting Mary at one of her estates. She happened to enter Mary's private chapel, where the Eucharistic host, the consecrated bread used in Catholic communion, was displayed on the altar. Mary genuflected, kneeling in reverence. Jane watched her. Then she asked why she was bowing. "I'm bowing to my Maker," Mary said. "No, you're bowing to a piece of bread made by a baker," Jane replied. For Catholics, the consecrated host is the body of Christ, literally. To call it a piece of bread wasn't just theological disagreement, it was blasphemy. For Protestants, the bread is symbolic, a reminder of Christ's sacrifice. To bow to it is idolatry. This wasn't an academic debate. This was the kind of argument that led to burnings at the stake across Europe. And here were two teenage cousins arguing about it in a chapel. Neither of them knew that within a year they'd be on opposite sides of a struggle for the throne of England. After the fall of the Seymour brothers, power shifted to a new man, John Dudley, Earl of Warwick. Dudley was a military hero. He'd fought in France, crushed rebellions, served Henry VIII with distinction. He was smart, pragmatic, and ruthlessly effective. He was also Protestant. In 1549, after the Duke of Somerset was ousted as Lord Protector, Dudley maneuvered himself into power. By 1551, he'd been made Duke of Northumberland. He controlled the Privy Council, managed the young king, and shaped policy across England. And unlike Somerset, who'd tried to rule as a quasi-dictator, Northumberland governed through consensus. He built coalitions, he made deals, he kept the Privy Council on his side. Most importantly, he kept Edward VI happy. Edward was growing up. By 1552, he was 15 years old, still young, but old enough to have opinions, to express preferences, to start thinking about ruling in his own right. And Edward was a true believer. He wasn't Protestant because it was politically convenient. He believed with absolute certainty that Catholicism was wrong, that the Pope was the Antichrist, that England's salvation depended on Protestant reform. Northumberland understood this. He aligned himself with Edward's beliefs, supported the reforms, and positioned himself as the king's loyal servant. Everything seemed stable. And then, in January 1553, Edward got sick. At first, it didn't seem serious. Edward had always been relatively healthy. Contrary to popular belief, he wasn't a sickly child. He'd had the usual childhood illnesses, but nothing life-threatening. But in early 1553, he developed a persistent cough, then a fever, then difficulty breathing. The royal physicians were baffled. They tried bloodletting, herbal remedies, prayers. Nothing worked. Edward seemed to recover briefly in the spring. For a few weeks, it looked like he might pull through. Then, in May, his condition deteriorated sharply. We don't know exactly what killed him. Tuberculosis is the most likely explanation. It was common in the 16th century and fits the symptoms. Others have suggested a bronchial infection that progressed to kidney failure. Whatever it was, by early June 1553, everyone close to the king knew he was dying. And that created a problem. Edward VI had no children. He wasn't even married. If he died, the crown would pass to his half-sister Mary according to their father's will. Mary, the Catholic. For Edward and Northumberland, this was unacceptable. Everything they'd worked for, the Protestant Reformation, the theological changes, the new Church of England, would be undone. Mary would reconcile with Rome. She'd restore Catholic Mass. She'd persecute Protestants. They couldn't let that happen. So Edward, in the final months of his life, began drafting a document called the Device for the Succession. The first version, written in January 1553, when Edward briefly thought he might recover, stated that the crown should pass to a male heir of the Grey family, specifically a son of Jane Grey or her sisters, if and when they married and had children. But by June, Edward knew he was dying soon. There was no time to wait for Jane to get married, get pregnant, and give birth to a son. So he revised the device. The new version named Jane Grey herself as his successor. Not Mary, not Elizabeth, Jane. It was a legal maneuver, a desperate attempt to preserve the Protestant settlement, but it was also a blatant violation of Henry VIII's will and arguably the law of the land. It didn't matter. Edward signed it, Northumberland backed it. The Privy Council, under pressure, agreed to it. And Jane Grey had no idea what was about to happen. Northumberland wasn't just trying to preserve the Protestant Reformation, he was also trying to preserve his own power. If Jane became queen, she'd need guidance. She was 16 years old, politically inexperienced, easily influenced. Northumberland could rule through her, just as he'd ruled through Edward. But to solidify his position, he needed a direct connection to the throne. He had 13 children. Most of his sons were already married, but one, Guilford Dudley, his second youngest son, was still unattached. On May 25, 1553, a triple wedding was held at Durham House in London. Jane Grey married Guilford Dudley. Jane's sister, Catherine, married the son of the Earl of Pembroke. One of Northumberland's daughters married the future Earl of Handing. It was a dynastic alliance, 3 powerful families binding themselves together. If Jane became queen, Northumberland's son would be king consort. Any children they had would be Dudley's. The wedding feast was lavish. There was music, dancing, endless courses of food. And then half the guests got food poisoning. It was an ominous start. Edward VI died on July 6, 1553, at Greenwich Palace. He was 15 years old. In his final weeks, he suffered horribly. His hair fell out, his nails fell out. He struggled to breathe, coughing up blood and mucus. Witnesses described his body as bloated, his skin discolored. His last words were a prayer. Lord God, deliver me out of this miserable and wretched life. And then he was gone. Northumberland immediately moved to suppress the news. The death was kept secret for 3 days while he finalized his plans. Jane was at a royal manor in Chelsea outside London. She had no idea the king was dead. She had no idea she'd been named his successor. On July 9th, 3 days after Edward's death, Northumberland sent his daughter to fetch Jane and bring her to Sion House near Richmond. There, in a grand hall surrounded by nobles and counselors, Jane was told the news. Edward was dead. He changed the succession. She was now Queen of England. Jane later said she was horrified. She claimed she fell to her knees and wept, saying she wasn't worthy, that Mary was the rightful heir, that she didn't want the crown. But it didn't matter what she wanted. The next day, July 10th, she was rowed down the Thames to London. At Cheapside, she was proclaimed queen. Trumpets sounded. Heralds read the proclamation. A teenage girl stood in front of a crowd and accepted the crown. And then she was taken to the Tower of London to wait.
The Tower of London wasn't just a prison. It was a fortress, a royal residence, a place where kings and queens stayed before their coronations. When Jane arrived on July 10th, it was meant to be a symbol of legitimacy. She was queen. The Tower was her home. But there was something ominous about it. The Tower had also been a place of execution. Anne Boleyn had been beheaded there. Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, had been beheaded there. Thomas Cromwell, Thomas More, Thomas Seymour, all executed within its walls. Jane must have felt it, the weight of history, the ghosts of the dead. She was given royal apartments. She was attended by servants. The machinery of government began moving. And across England, proclamations were issued. Edward VI was dead. Jane Grey was queen. Long live the queen. But in Suffolk, at Framlingham Castle, another proclamation was being prepared. Mary Tudor wasn't at court when Edward died. Northumberland had invited her to London to see her dying brother, but she'd refused. She suspected, rightly, that it was a trap, that Northumberland wanted to arrest her and prevent her from claiming the throne. Instead, she fled to East Anglia, to estates loyal to her. She gathered supporters. She sent letters to nobles across England, reminding them that she was the rightful heir according to Henry VIII's will and English law. And people listened. Mary had something Jane didn't: legitimacy. Whatever Edward's device said, most people believed the crown should pass to Henry VIII's daughter. That's what the late king had wanted. That's what the law said. Also, Mary had something else: Catholicism. England was still, by and large, a Catholic country. Yes, the Protestant reforms had taken root in London and the southeast. Yes, Cambridge and Oxford had produced a generation of Protestant scholars. But most people in the countryside, in the north, in the west, they'd never fully accepted the changes. They still believed in the old religion. Mary represented a return to normalcy. Jane represented a Protestant coup. By July 12th, just 2 days after Jane was proclaimed queen, support for Mary was growing rapidly. In London, Northumberland realized he had a problem. He'd expected some resistance, but not this much. He'd expected Mary to quietly accept defeat, but instead, she was gathering an army. On July 13th, a man in London was arrested for denying Jane's right to the throne. As punishment, his ears were cut off. It was a warning, but it didn't stop the rumors. By July 14th, it was clear that Northumberland couldn't control the situation from London. He'd have to confront Mary directly. He gathered troops. He prepared to march north, to Framlingham. But before he left, he made a critical mistake. He didn't secure the Privy Council. Many of the nobles who'd signed Edward's device had done so under pressure. They didn't believe in Jane's claim. They were loyal to Northumberland, not to Jane. And when Northumberland left London, that loyalty began to crack. Northumberland reached Cambridge on July 18th. He planned to continue to Framlingham the next day, to meet Mary's forces head-on. But then he received urgent news. The Privy Council in London was turning against him. Northumberland rode back toward the capital immediately, but he was too late. On July 19th, the Privy Council gathered at Baynard's Castle in London. One by one, the nobles who'd supported Jane's claim changed sides. They declared Mary the rightful queen. They ordered Northumberland's arrest. And they sent word to Jane. Her reign was over. At the Tower of London, Jane's father entered her apartments. He told her the news. Then he went outside and personally tore down the canopy over the throne, the physical symbol of her queenship. She'd been queen for 9 days. Across London, the proclamation went out. Mary was queen. Jane was a pretender. In the streets, people celebrated. Bells rang. Bonfires were lit. London erupted in joy. For many, this wasn't about religion, it was about legitimacy. Mary was Henry VIII's daughter. She was the rightful heir. The natural order had been restored. Northumberland, realizing his situation was hopeless, tried to switch sides. He rode into the market square at Cambridge and proclaimed Mary queen himself. It didn't matter. He was arrested on July 24th, taken to London, and imprisoned in the Tower. Jane and Guilford were already there, now prisoners rather than royalty. And Mary Tudor, the woman Jane had mocked a year earlier for bowing to a piece of bread, was on her way to London to claim her throne.
Mary entered London on August 3rd, 1553, riding through streets packed with cheering crowds. She'd won. Against all odds, she'd outmaneuvered Northumberland, claimed her birthright, and become the first undisputed Queen of England. Now she faced a question: what to do with the conspirators? Northumberland was the easy case.
He was executed on August 22nd, less than a month after Jane's deposition. Before he died, he publicly recanted his Protestant faith and converted back to Catholicism, a desperate, humiliating attempt to save his soul, if not his life. It didn't work. He was beheaded at Tower Hill. But Jane was more complicated. Mary knew Jane hadn't orchestrated the coup. Everyone knew that. Jane was a pawn, manipulated by Northumberland and her own father. She was 16 years old. She'd been queen for 9 days. She'd never wanted the crown. More than that, Jane was Mary's cousin. They were family, both great-granddaughters of Henry VII. So Mary initially showed mercy. Jane, Guilford, and 2 of Northumberland's other sons were tried for treason in November 1553. The verdict was inevitable, guilty. But Mary made it clear she didn't intend to carry out the sentence. If Jane begged for mercy, if she renounced her claim, if she accepted Mary as the rightful queen, she'd be spared. Jane was sent back to the Tower, but this time she was a prisoner waiting for pardon, not execution. For a few months, it seemed like she might survive. Mary didn't waste time. As soon as she was crowned, she began rolling back the Protestant reforms. Catholic Mass was restored. Churches were redecorated with the altars, vestments, and imagery that had been stripped away under Edward. Statues of saints reappeared. Latin replaced English in services. Theologically, England was returned to Catholic orthodoxy. The 7 sacraments were reinstated. Transubstantiation was reaffirmed. Prayers for the dead, which Protestants had abolished, came back. And then came the harder part, reconciling with Rome. In November 1554, Cardinal Reginald Pole, the Pope's legate, arrived in England. Parliament passed a series of acts repealing the anti-Catholic legislation of the previous 2 decades. England formally acknowledged papal authority again. Mary stopped short of reversing the dissolution of the monasteries. Too much land had been sold, too many powerful people would have been affected. But in every other way, she undid the Reformation. And then she started persecuting Protestants. At first, it was just the leaders. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who'd annulled Henry VIII's marriage and overseen the English Reformation, was arrested, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake in 1556. Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, 2 bishops and leading Protestant theologians, were burned together at Oxford in 1555. But Mary didn't stop with the leadership. She went after ordinary people, merchants, artisans, farmers, anyone who refused to recant their Protestant beliefs. By the end of her reign, between 270 and 300 Protestants had been executed. Most were burned alive, a particularly brutal form of execution reserved for heretics. Mary believed she was saving England's soul, but history would remember her differently. She became Bloody Mary. In January 1554, while Jane was still imprisoned in the Tower, a Protestant rebellion broke out in Kent. It was led by Thomas Wyatt, a committed Protestant who opposed Mary's plan to marry Philip II of Spain. The rebellion had support in several regions, but most of the conspirators backed out at the last minute. Wyatt managed to gather a force and march on London. For a few days, it looked like he might actually succeed, but Mary rallied her troops, held the city, and Wyatt was defeated. The rebellion failed, but it changed everything for Jane. Mary had been willing to spare Jane when she was just a pawn in Northumberland's scheme, but now Protestants were actively rebelling. Jane, as a Protestant claimant to the throne, was a rallying point for future conspiracies. Worse, Jane's father, the Duke of Suffolk, had joined Wyatt's rebellion. He'd been pardoned for his role in the 1553 coup, and then he'd immediately turned around and joined another conspiracy. Mary couldn't tolerate it anymore. The decision was made. Jane Grey would die. In early February 1554, Jane was informed that her execution had been scheduled for February 12th. She was allowed visits from Mary's chaplain, John Feckenham, who tried to convince her to convert to Catholicism. If she recanted, Mary might still spare her.
Jane refused. The two had long theological debates. Feckenham later wrote about them, describing Jane's intelligence, her command of Scripture, her absolute conviction. But she wouldn't budge. She was Protestant. She believed the Catholic Church was wrong. She would not lie about her faith to save her life. "I have come hither to die," she would later say, "and by a law I am condemned to the same." On the night of February 11th, Jane wrote a letter to her sister, Catherine. In it, she included a passage from the New Testament in Greek, along with her own English translation and commentary. She was 16 years old, about to be executed, and she was still teaching. The execution was scheduled for Tower Green, a private area inside the Tower of London reserved for high-profile executions. Guilford Dudley was executed first at Tower Hill, a public execution ground. Jane was allowed to watch from a window. Then it was her turn. She walked to the scaffold wearing a simple black dress. She was calm, composed, steady. She gave a short speech to the witnesses, admitting she'd been part of the conspiracy, but insisting she hadn't sought the crown. She accepted her sentence. She forgave those who condemned her. Then she knelt and recited Psalm 51, "Have mercy upon me, O God." The executioner asked for her forgiveness, as was customary. She granted it. She tied a blindfold over her own eyes, and then she reached for the block, but she couldn't find it. "What shall I do? Where is it?" she asked, her voice rising in panic. Someone guided her hands to the block. She laid her head down. Her final words were those of Jesus on the cross, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." The axe fell. Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, was dead. She was 16 years old, maybe 17. We still don't know for sure. Her body was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, inside the tower walls, next to Guilford's. No monument, no ceremony, just another grave among dozens of others.
The story of Jane Grey is a story of what-ifs. What if Edward VI had lived another 10 years? He would have married, probably had children, secured the Protestant succession. Jane would have lived out her life as a minor noblewoman, remembered only as a particularly well-educated member of the Tudor court. What if Northumberland had been less ambitious? If he'd accepted Mary's claim, stepped aside, maybe negotiated for himself and his family, he might have survived. Jane certainly would have. What if Jane had converted? If she'd recanted her Protestant faith, accepted Catholicism, begged Mary for mercy, she might have been spared. She was young. She was family. Mary wanted to be merciful. But Jane chose principle over survival. And that choice turned her into something more than a footnote. It turned her into a martyr. Mary ruled for 5 years, from 1553 to 1558, and she did exactly what the Protestant faction had feared. She reversed the Reformation, reconciled with Rome, and persecuted Protestants with ruthless efficiency. But it didn't work. England didn't return to Catholicism peacefully. The burnings created martyrs. The marriage to Philip II of Spain made Mary unpopular. England didn't want a Spanish king. The loss of Calais, England's last territory in France, was a humiliation. And then Mary's health failed. She had 2 phantom pregnancies, probably symptoms of the uterine cancer that would kill her. She died in November 1558, aged 42, having politically astute, willing to compromise. She was Protestant, but not radically so. She liked ceremony, pageantry, some of the old Catholic traditions. But she also believed in the supremacy of the English crown over the church. So she crafted what became known as the Elizabethan religious settlement, a middle path that retained some Catholic elements while affirming Protestant theology. It wasn't Calvinism, like Edward VI had wanted. It wasn't Catholicism, like Mary had restored. It was something uniquely English. And it stuck. Elizabeth ruled for 45 years. That was enough time for an entire 53. After Elizabeth came to power, Jane Grey was resurrected. Not literally, but symbolically.
Protestant writers like John Foxe seized on her story. In his Book of Martyrs, first published in 1563, Foxe portrayed Jane as an innocent victim, a teenage girl murdered by the tyrannical Catholic Queen Mary. He included her final letters, her theological debates with Feckenham, her speech on the scaffold. He painted her as a model of Protestant faith, intelligent, devout, willing to die rather than compromise her beliefs. And that image stuck. For generations of English Protestants, Jane Grey was a heroine, proof that Catholicism was cruel and tyrannical, proof that the Protestant cause was worth dying for. But that image was also selective. It erased the political reality that Jane was part of a coup, that her claim to the throne was legally dubious, that Northumberland had used her to preserve his own power. It turned a complicated historical figure into a simple symbol. So who was the real Jane Grey? We actually don't know what she looked like. There's one portrait, the Streatham portrait, that might depict her. It shows a young woman with reddish-brown hair holding a prayer book, wearing fine jewelry and a French hood. But the inscription is faded. Some historians doubt it's even Jane at all. What we do know is that she was exceptionally intelligent. She read Plato in Greek at 14. She corresponded with leading theologians in Latin. She was learning Hebrew to read the Old Testament. We know she was devoutly Protestant, not casually, not for political convenience, but with absolute conviction. She believed Catholicism was wrong. She was willing to die for that belief. We know she was isolated. Her parents were strict, possibly abusive. She didn't fit in with other teenagers. She preferred books to people. And we know she was unlucky. She was born the wrong time, into the wrong family, with the wrong bloodline. She became a pawn in a game she didn't understand and didn't want to play. And she died for it.
Lady Jane Grey's story is a tragedy in the classical sense. It's a story about fate, about forces larger than any individual, about the impossibility of escaping the circumstances of your birth. Jane didn't choose to be born into the Tudor family. She didn't choose to carry royal blood. She didn't choose to live through the most turbulent period of religious upheaval in English history. But those circumstances defined her life and determined her death. She was smart, devout, principled. In another time, another place, those qualities would have made her remarkable in a positive way, a scholar, a writer, a religious thinker. Instead, they made her dangerous. Her intelligence made her useful to Northumberland. Her devotion to Protestantism made her a threat to Mary. Her royal blood made her impossible to ignore. And so, she died. The 9 Days Queen. The girl who was queen for less than 2 weeks. The teenager who refused to convert, refused to beg for mercy, refused to compromise her beliefs even when it would have saved her life. Was she brave? Absolutely. Was she foolish? Maybe. Was she a victim? Without question. In the end, Jane Grey's story isn't about where teenage girls can be executed for crimes they barely understood. It's about a girl who read Plato in Greek, who argued theology with her royal cousin, who stood on a scaffold at 16 and commended her spirit to God. And then she was gone. But her story centuries. Lady Jane Grey, born into a world she didn't choose, used by men she couldn't resist, killed for a crown she never wanted. The 9 Days Queen, forever 16, forever remembered. This is the story most people never heard in history class. History remembers the powerful, the kings, the queens, the men who moved armies and changed laws. But sometimes the most revealing stories are about the people on the margins, the ones who were swept up in events, who made choices under impossible pressure, who died young and left us wondering what they might have become. Jane Grey was one of those people,
And her story matters not because she was queen for 9 days, but because she was human for 16 years.